a new endpoint returning 500 on invalid input, your frontend shows a generic error toast. The root cause, no validation exception handler, so FastAPI treats it as an unhandled exception. Let's break down FastAPI Basics, how it works, and the exact mistake behind that failure. FastAPI is a modern Python web framework for building APIs with automatic OpenAPI documentation, built-in data validation via Pydantic, and native Async support. It exists because Flask and Django require significant boilerplate for request validation, serialization, and interactive docs. FastAPI eliminates that by inferring schemas from Python type hints. Flask was designed in 2010, before Python type hints and async await. FastAPI was designed in 2018, specifically around type hints and the ASGI standard. When you write a type hint in FastAPI, the framework reads it at startup and uses it to validate incoming data, serialize outgoing data, and generate documentation. You write the types once and get 3 things for free. Let's create our first FastAPI application. You install FastAPI and Unicorn, create an app instance, and define endpoints using decorators. FastAPI automatically converts Python dicts to JSON responses. Here's the minimal FastAPI app. The app decorator registers the function as a handler for GET requests. FastAPI converts the returned dict to JSON automatically. Visit docs for interactive Swagger UI. Every API needs to accept input. FastAPI gives you 3 clean ways: path parameters for resource identification, query parameters for filtering, and request bodies for complex data. FastAPI infers the parameter type from the function signature, no extra decorators needed. Here's a complete bookstore API demonstrating path parameters, query parameters, and request bodies. The Pydantic model book defines validation rules. Path parameter bookid identifies a specific book, query parameter genre and limit filter the list, and the request body creates a new book. Use async def when your endpoint does I/O database queries, HTTP calls. FastAPI runs plain def in a thread pool automatically. Dependency injection via depends lets you share authentication, DB sessions, and config cleanly. FastAPI caches dependency results per request automatically. This endpoint uses an async def to fetch a random quote asynchronously. The require API key dependency validates the XAPI key header. FastAPI injects the dependency result into the endpoint. Notice the use of HTTPX, async client for non-blocking HTTP calls. FastAPI automatically returns proper HTTP responses for validation errors, 422, and server errors, 500. For business logic errors, you can raise HTTP exception or define custom exception handlers to return consistent error payloads across your API. Here's a custom exception handler for insufficient funds error. When the endpoint raises this exception, the handler returns a structured 402 response with balanced details. This keeps endpoint code clean and error responses uniform. FastAPI comes with a built-in testing utility, TestClient, based on HTTPX. It lets you send requests to your app without running a server perfect for unit tests. You can override dependencies using app dependency overrides to isolate the code you're testing. Here are tests for the Bookstore API. TestClient sends requests and checks responses. The fixture overrides dependencies for isolated testing. Run with PyDistV. I've seen projects crumble because someone hard-coded a database URL into the code. FastAPI's base settings from Pydantic makes this literally a one-liner. You define a class that inherits from base settings, declare your environment variables with type hints, and FastAPI automatically loads them from env files or environment variables. This app settings class loads database URL and secret key from an env file. The model config specifies the env file and encoding. Access settings, database URL anywhere in your app. Middleware is code that runs before every request and after every response. It lets you enforce cross-cutting concerns without touching a single endpoint. Use it for logging, CORS, security headers, and request timing. This middleware adds an xProcessTime header to every response and logs the request duration. It wraps the callNext function to measure time. Middleware is the only way to enforce global behavior without touching every route. Background tasks let you push work into a background thread after the response is sent. This keeps the HTTP response fast. Use it for non-critical operations like sending welcome emails. For critical jobs, use a proper queue like Celery. The createUser endpoint adds a background task to send a welcome email. The response returns immediately, and the email sends a moment later. Always wrap background task logic in try-except to handle exceptions silently swallowed by FastAPI. This is the same issue we highlighted at the start. Here's exactly why that happened. The endpoint parameter was declared as userid. Int, but no validation exception handler was configured. Without an explicit RequestValidationError handler, FastAPI returned a generic 500 when Pydantic validation failed, because the error propagated through the default exception handler, which treated all unhandled exceptions the same way. The root cause was the absence of a global RequestValidationError handler, causing FastAPI to return a generic 500 instead of a structured 422 when invalid input was passed. The fix is to add a global exception handler for RequestValidationError that returns 422 with a structured error body. Also use query with pattern constraints to catch malformed input before Pydantic model parsing. This ensures invalid input always returns a clean 422 instead of a generic 500. Without a RequestValidationError handler, invalid input like a non-numeric userid returns a generic 500 error. Always add a global handler to return a structured 422 response. If you define a root books featured after books bookid, FastAPI matches top-down and treats featured as a book ID. If bookid is typed as int, it returns a 422 validation error. Always register static roots before dynamic ones. Using the synchronous requests library inside an Async endpoint blocks the event loop. Under concurrent load, request latency spikes, and eventually the server stops responding. Always use HTTPX, Async client with a wait for HTTP calls in Async endpoints. This article uses Pydantic v2 syntax, model config instead of config class. If you are on Pydantic v1, FastAPI 0, 100, 0, use class config with nfile and extra inside. Check your FastAPI version with pip show FastAPI. The article mentions overriding dependencies, but doesn't show a complete test example. Here's a concrete pattern using app dependency overrides with a fixture that cleans up after each test. Exceptions in background tasks are silently swallowed. Always wrap task logic in try-except and log errors. For critical jobs, use a durable queue like Celery or RQ. To debug validation errors, check the response body for field-level details. Use the Swagger UI at docs to test endpoints interactively. For root order issues, run Uvicorn with log-level debug to see registered routes. For async blocking, grep for async def functions that lack await calls. Let's run through some common interview questions. Explain Starlet plus Pydantic architecture. Starlet handles ASGI, Pydantic validates data, FastAPI orchestrates. Root users me returns 422. Static root must come before dynamic root to avoid type conversion error. When is async def slower? CPU-bound tasks block event loop. Plain def runs in thread pool for parallelism. And a few frequently asked questions. Do I need async? No, plain def works. Async for I/O performance. What is Pydantic? Data validation library using type hints. 422 vs 400. 422 for validation shape errors, 400 for business logic errors. FastAPI reads your Python type hints at startup to power automatic request validation, response serialization, and interactive docs. Path parameters identify resources, query parameters filter collections, and request bodies carry complex data. Use async def for I/O-bound endpoints and plain def for CPU work. Dependency injection via depends keeps endpoints thin. Custom exception handlers ensure consistent error payloads. TestClient lets you test without a server. Ready to go deeper? Up next, Celery for task queues in Python, then Pytest fixtures, then beautiful soup web scraping. Find them all at TheCodeForge.io. Thanks for watching. The full article and code examples are covered in detail at TheCodeForge.io.